So there's this really fascinating economic puzzle happening right now. The US government is shelling out over $1 trillion a year just in interest payments on its debt. But the reason for this huge spike in cost, well, it's probably not what you're thinking. Let's dive in and unpack this.
Okay, let's just start with this number. It's almost hard to wrap your head around. $1.2 trillion. That's what the US government is paying every single year just on interest. To put that in perspective, back in 2020, just a few years ago, that number was around $500 billion. So it's more than doubled. It's actually more than the entire US military budget. So the big question is, what on earth is causing this insane spike?
Now, your first guess, and it's a good one, would be that interest rates must have just gone through the roof, right? But here's where it gets weird. They haven't, not really. The key benchmark, the 10-year Treasury yield, it's sitting around 4.5%. And get this, that's almost the exact same level it was back in the summer of 2007, a time when pretty much everyone agreed the economy was doing great.
So that brings us to the core question of this whole thing. If the rate is basically the same, and we've handled this level just fine in the past, why are the interest payments blowing up now? What's the real difference? What changed?
Well, the answer comes down to one single critical variable that has completely flipped the script. Let's take a look at the missing piece of the puzzle.
And here it is, the big one. Back in 2007, the total national debt was $9 trillion. Today, it has absolutely ballooned to over $34 trillion. So you see, even though the interest rate is the same, we're applying it to a pile of debt that is just massively, massively bigger. It's more than tripled.
And that bigger pile of debt creates what you could call a multiplier effect. Think about it like this. Back in 2007, if rates went up by 1%, it added about $90 billion to the annual interest bill. Okay, but today, that same 1% hike adds a jaw-dropping $340 billion. The rate itself looks the same on a piece of paper, but its real-world impact, its cost, is so much more powerful now.
And this is really the key takeaway. The US economy is just different now. The source material uses a great analogy for this. It's become more allergic to the exact same interest rate it used to handle with no problem. It's kind of like medicine, right? Your body might handle one pill just fine, but taking 4 pills of the same strength, that could be a huge problem. And that's pretty much where we're at. Okay, but you might be wondering, how does this higher cost actually show up in the government's bank account? Well, it happens through this really slow but incredibly powerful process called the rollover squeeze. So here's the mechanics of it. A huge chunk of the government's debt was actually issued during the pandemic when interest rates were basically zero. But here's the catch. That debt has an expiration date, and as it comes due, or matures, the Treasury has to pay back the lenders. So how do they get the cash? They issue new debt, but that new debt has to be sold at today's much higher 4.5% rate. And that really gets to the core of it. This isn't some sudden, one-time shock to the system. It's this slow, methodical, relentless squeeze. Literally every single month, more of that super cheap old debt is getting replaced with this new, much more expensive debt. And that just keeps cranking up the government's total interest bill.
And the scale of this, it's just immense. In a single year, say 2025, we're talking about over $7 trillion in debt that has to be rolled over. So that means trillions of dollars in loans that used to cost the government maybe 1% are now going to cost it over 4%. When you see it like that, it's pretty easy to understand why the total interest payment has shot up so fast.
All right, so I know this all sounds pretty grim, but is there a way out of this? Well, it turns out this isn't the first time the US has been staring down a mountain of debt this big. And if we look back, history actually gives us a potential roadmap. So after World War II, the US debt was at a staggering 120% of GDP, the entire economic output of the country, which is, believe it or not, right about where we are today. But here's the thing, the country didn't default, and they didn't slash spending like crazy to pay it all back. They did something much, much smarter.
They decided to outgrow the debt. Now, the strategy is actually pretty simple, at least in theory. You just have to make sure your economy is growing faster than your interest payments are. It's like your personal finances, right? If you get a 5% raise at work, but your credit card interest is only 2%, that debt is manageable because your income is growing way faster than the debt is. And that is exactly what the US did in the decades after the war.
And that brings us to the final and really the most important point. The entire future of this debt problem all comes down to that one simple relationship. It's like the US is standing at a fork in the road with two very, very different futures ahead. And really,
It all boils down to these two scenarios. Scenario 1, we're on the growth path. That's where the economy's growth rate stays higher than the interest rate on the debt. If that happens, the debt is totally manageable. We can outgrow it. But scenario 2 is the trap. That's what happens if economic growth slows down and dips below the interest rate. In that case, the interest costs start growing faster than our ability to pay, and the whole problem can really start to spiral.
So what could keep us on that good path, the growth path? Well, a lot of analysts are pointing to one potential wild card: AI. The hope, or the theory, is that artificial intelligence could unleash this massive wave of productivity across the whole economy, and that could push growth high enough to keep us ahead of the interest payments, kind of like that big post-war economic boom did all those years ago.
And that really leaves us with a final trillion-dollar question, doesn't it? Is this new normal of 4.5% interest rates just the price of admission for a new era of high growth? Or is it a tripwire that's about to send us falling into a mathematical debt trap? Honestly, we don't know yet. The answer is going to be written in the economic data that comes out over the next few years,